We're moving on to Ruth Amossy, who's Professor Emerita and is a specialist of French literature, discourse analysis, and argumentation. She's the author of a textbook, L'Argumentation dans le discours, and has published extensively on stereotypes and cliches, on ethos, and on polemics. Her book, In Defense of Polemics, originally in 2014 in French, has been translated in 4 languages. She is the coordinator of a research group, ADAR, I'll skip that, at the Porter Institute at Tel Aviv University, and the chief editor of a scientific journal, Argumentation et Analyse du Discours, in the emerging sources of the web of sciences. And her talk today is about boycott. Is boycott a form of violence? And this is going to be an argumentative perspective on this topic. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anat. So actually, I want to take an argumentative perspective on this question of boycott. Is boycotting a form of violence? Yeah, okay. I will start with a short anecdote, a personal anecdote. A few years ago, we had an agreement with the prestigious Collège de France, and we signed the agreement there, and we had also a conference. And then the BDS came, and they didn't approve of it. They sent a letter to all the members of the Collège de France, and they also wrote a few very, very nasty words about me. And I just hated the whole thing, and I was against it. And here a few weeks ago, our president, Professor Ariel Porat, announced, among his other announcements, that he will not work with companies who would legally deny service to people on religious grounds. There was a bill, about that happily, did have no result. And I was so proud of my university, of my president, that they are going to boycott. So I thought, okay, let's, stop a minute. And maybe I have to deal with my own contradiction and look into the subject. So I started with argumentation because it is my topic. And actually, when Chaim Perlman turned to argumentation, he was a philosopher of law. And he turned to argumentation because he saw in it means to prevent violence. This was in the 50s, after World War II. Because argumentation is, first of all, deliberation. It is an attempt at persuading people and not forcing them into doing something. And it is the recognition of the other. The other has the right to express his view. Thus, in the terms not of Perlman, but of Chantal Mouffe, in transform the enemy into an adversary, because the adversary has the right to speak, and he has to be countered but not annihilated. So, so argumentation would be a democratic way of reaching an agreement, and it is supposed to help preventing outbursts of physical violence. So how should we understand boycotts from an argumentative perspective? And also my question was, because I'm a discourse analyst, how do people who recur to boycott, how do they justify it? How do they justify recurring to it? Or how do justify their condemnation of boycott? So this was the initial question. And then I took official text of the BDS on their sites, and I took a report of Reut, an official Israeli institution who was denouncing BDS, and also some, more paper that could help me. Okay, so what I will do here is, first of all, very shortly to give some definition of violence, some definition of boycott, and then mostly make an argumentative and discursive analysis of this text that are justification or attacks on the BDS. Okay, so we already talked about it. You can have physical violence, legitimate state violence, if we take Max Weber, or symbolic violence in its systemic meaning, Pierre Bourdieu. But I will focus on symbolic violence in a more general meaning, as a non-physical aggression, still an aggression, aiming at causing damage, severe damage. The damage can be material, can be psychological, or, so because I'm a discourse analyst, verbal violence, aggressing the other or preventing him from speaking, which is also a form of violence. Okay, now the question is violence negative by definition? We all know, I think, that it is not. Of course, it is disruptive, it is destructive. So some of its expression are under the scope of law. We will come back to it. But on the other hand, it is considered sometimes as an avoidable means of struggle. But my point here is that the parties who are recurring to violence, they are bound to account for their choice. They have to justify it on practical and also ethical grounds. Now, just I have, before I go on, I have, of course, to speak about non-violent action, a generic term covering dozens of specific methods of protest, without using physical violence. This is have here the definition of a specialist, Sharp. Also, she called this means weapons, and she speaks about the struggle. And some people point out that non-violent action can be coercive and cause non-physical harm. Okay. So, what about boycott? I will have a short lexicographic survey. I took a few dictionaries, as I always do, and one of the definitions is that is a voluntary withdrawal intended to manifest a negative opinion or feeling. This is what you find in the Cambridge Dictionary, for instance, which is an action of refusing to buy a product, etc., way of expressing strong disapproval. But in other dictionaries, you find other definition presenting boycott as an act of exclusion, a banishment justified in moral terms. You know, people want to right wrongs. This is what you find in the Merriam-Webster, to force acceptance, and in the Britannica, a collective and organized ostracism, etc. So, in these boycotts, I will I will not look at state boycotts, you know, like blocus or embargo. I will not look at economic boycott that are exclusively instrumental, but rather ideological boycott, I would say, organized on ideological or ethical grounds. Okay, so let's start. First, in defense of boycott. So you have the discourse of the BDS movement, as I found it in the internet. Okay, everybody knows that boycott here, the BDS, is defined as a non-violent way of promoting the Palestinian cause. And here is a quotation. In 2005, Palestinian civil society organization called for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, as a form of non-violent pressure on Israel. And another one, inspired by the South African anti-apartheid movement, the Palestinian BDS call urges non-violent pressure on Israel until it complies with international law, etc. So what about pressure? Is pressure argumentation or is pressure violence? So I go on, with my dictionary. It was very interesting because one of the definitions said it is the act of trying to make someone else do something by arguing, persuading. So it places BDS, the BDS pressure, in the category of argumentation, which is by definition non-violent, as we said before. But the Collins Dictionary said, if there is pressure on a person, someone is trying to persuade or force them to do something. And another dictionary, to force someone toward a particular end. In other words, pressure is using force to make the other comply. So you can see the ambiguity underlying the presentation of BDS. On the one hand, the notion of force and forcing somebody to do something against his will. And on the other hand, the notion of reasoned persuasion. And those two elements appear, in the same definition in all kinds of dictionary. And it turns out that such ambiguity allows for the interpretation of boycott as a non-violent attempt at persuasion, but at the same time, it makes clear that it is a way to subdue the other. Okay, so here is another quotation. Boycott involved withdrawing support from Israel's apartheid regime, complicit Israel sporting, cultural, and academic institution, etc. You can see here the quotation. So support, as you know, is to give assistance, especially financially, to enable to function or act. It is important because withdrawing support means that you are not helping, you don't want to help the other party. So this formulation empties boycotting of all its symbolic violence, because it is not presented an aggressive act of shunning. It is a refusal to be part of a global mechanism that enables Israel to pursue its goals. And it is also refusing complicity. Israel is called an apartheid regime. Complicity is helping someone accomplish a crime. Thus, boycott means refusing to help somebody accomplish a crime. And it is thus interpreted as an act of preventing violence, or at least refusing to participate in violence, rather than a symbolic violent act. Same thing about collaboration as an active involvement in a crime, and they give as an example the European Horizon 2020, saying that they should not have included Israel in this kind, of scientific project, which is whitewashing, it's a list of violation, an attempt to stop people finding the true fact, etc. This is the Palestinian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. Okay, so what you have here, other quotation, because those in power refuse to act to stop this injustice, Palestinian civil society has called for a global citizen response of solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for freedom, justice, and equality. Thus, instead of breaking the link, which is part of the definition I gave at the beginning, they are creating a beneficial link. And instead of, that's what we find in the text, okay? It's not my personal opinion, I'm just reading the text. And they say that instead of rejecting the adversary or the perpetrator, they care for the other, for the innocent victim, which is to say an act of solidarity with the oppressed. You have here an ethical justification for refraining from relation with the target of the boycott. And it is a community of feeling and interest with the oppressed. Now, the model, as you know, is the South African boycott, that defined itself as an international solidarity movement. And the analogy used as an argument from the precedent, an historical example, meaning, okay, that this example proves the efficacy of the method. So, clearly an act of solidarity with the oppressed is the contrary of an act of violence. It aims at helping and not at causing damage. At the same time, and I will not dwell on time, the BDS supporters are constructing a collective ethos, reinforcing a presentation of self as virtuous person endowed with ethical principle and engaged in the defense of fundamental rights. Okay, but the other side, is it ethical? I go like GPT, ChatGPT, they say, however, but is it ethical to assert facts and pronounce condemnation while refusing to hear the other, expelling him from the dialogue? Now, I came back to the new rhetoric before I take the text. And this is very interesting because in the new rhetoric, Perlman says actually that it is not always commendable to wish to persuade someone. I mean, there are some people that you don't have to persuade. You are not supposed to talk with them at all. And he gives as an example Churchill, the attitude of Churchill forbidding British diplomats even to listen to any peace proposal German emissary might try to convey. Maybe for those who know France, there was this discussion long ago about Le Pen. Faut-il parler avec le Front National? Should we speak with them? We are much beyond that. So, to withdraw from any verbal exchange and ignore the other might appear as an act of symbolic violence, but in certain cases it might be defined as legitimate violence guided by ethical principle. But what would be the condition for such a symbolic violence? Well, first of all, you have to show that the other party is not commendable. And secondly, you have to show that all the attempts at interaction have already failed, so that you have no choice. And I think this is what you find in this quotation of the BDS, since in its violent establishment in 1948 through the ethnic cleansing of more than half of the indigenous people of Palestine, Israel has set out to control as much land and uproot as many Palestinians as it can, or Israeli leaders routinely and openly incite racial violence against the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. So, okay, what about blaming boycott as a violent means of action? What does Reut say? First of all, I start with this article of Omri Böhm, who happens to be a very violent, to oppose very violently the politics of the government. But he thinks that silencing individual is one of the deepest form of violence we know. I need no time, the others, On the face of it, imposing a boycott on Israeli academic is an obvious form of violent political action. So, condemning boycott, it does not respect freedom of speech. It is an act of discrimination. It is a negation of the basic democratic principle of equality. And this is why boycott is sometimes deemed illegal, as was the case in France with the Circulaire à Lyon-Marie. It was defined as a public incitement to discrimination in other countries too. So, what is condemned here is a process of demonization, branding Israel as aggressive, discriminatory, and occupying, so that the most outrageous allegation, such as organ harvesting, can stick aggressive action against Israel and Israeli, are justified and called for. So demonization is hate speech that is inherently violent, leaves no room for dialogue, and it replaces shared reasoning by emotional attitude. So in this perspective, demonization appears as a kind of verbal violence that calls for the negation of the other. And the other claim is that it is an act of delegitimization, the negation of Israel's rights to exist, or of the right of the Jewish people to self-determination, an attack deemed violent in its very objective, since you deny somebody the right to exist, to annihilate Israel by isolating and cutting it off from all international and economic relations until it collapses. Okay, so this anti-boycott discourse sees in the proclaimed non-violence a way to dissimulate actual violence, the actual violence of the call for boycotting, a way to go on with the struggle with other means. And the violence is not physical, but no less powerful and destructive. It wants to eventually annihilate the Jewish state. Okay. So what do we have here? I'm working general. My topic is controversies, public polemic. So here we go. We can see how each party emphasizes one element on the constitutive definition of the boycott. They present it. You have the polarization of polemics, of controversy, either as a nonviolent action, solidarity with the victim and a refusal of complicity, and then it is justified, or as a symbolic violence in the form of ostracism, aiming at delegitimation and destruction, and then, of course, you have to condemn boycott. You notice that both definitions are justified on the basis of the same global values. The controversy is not on the basic values, the values like freedom, non-discrimination, etc. So, instead, I'm finishing in a few minutes. Instead of considering the complexity of the issue, each party chooses its own version. And it chooses, both versions exist, it chooses its own version according to its own beliefs and ideological framework in an act of polarization. You have proclaimed anti-colonialism and anti-racism versus Zionism as the right of self-determination for the Jews. So the judgment of the violence or non-violence of boycott and the fact that they are not legitimate, they are not only ethical, they are also and mainly ideological and political. And what do we do when there is no clear-cut answer? From our argumentative point of view, what we can defend, we can say, okay, we need to keep the necessity, for an argumentation process in search of an agreement. And then boycott is really violent. Or you can say, as in the case of Churchill and the Nazis, evoked by Perlman, that you have the right, and even there is a necessity to cut all ties with the other and ostracize him when it is not commendable to speak with him. And then you need violence, but it is a legitimate force of violence. So you see, I'm sorry to say that for me there is no absolute truth to the matter. It is weighted in each case and depends on the ideological position and the shared premises of the involved parties. So there is no clear-cut answer, but I hope, however, that our journey through the meander of the issue has shed some light on the ins and outs of the violence of boycott and justified the necessity to consider their complexity. Thank you for your attention.